coming. This is a much bigger turnout than I anticipated, so I really appreciate everyone being here. I am Andrea LaMarre, and I am going to talk tonight about social media, eating disorders, and social justice. To give you a little bit of background about who I am, that's me in my natural habitat with a coffee and my phone. That's where I will be most likely found, tweeting usually. I spend a heck of a lot too much time on Twitter. And I am also a PhD student at the University of Guelph, and my research mainly focuses on eating disorder recovery. And I work under the advisorship of an amazing mentor called Dr. Carla Rice, and her work mainly centers on embodiment, and it centers on bodily difference, and basically just the ways that we can make our world a better place for people who live in all different sorts of bodies. So building on her research program, I really took it in the eating disorders direction, drawing on my own personal experiences of having recovered. And I thought that I would like to make a difference in this field by doing research. So I have since become very, very involved with social media. This has been kind of become my claim to fame, I guess, if I have a claim to fame. I tweet a lot, as I mentioned. I also tweet for a number of different accounts. So I'm a member of the social media committee of the Academy for Eating Disorders. I'm also the chair of the social media committee for the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. And we have members here from previous and current. And what else do I do? I also am trying to convince the Eating Disorder Association of Canada to get Twitter, and that's an ongoing discussion that we're having. Because basically what I think is that social media is a great space for us to engage in conversations. And it's a great space for us to get involved and to really reach out to all different sorts of stakeholders. So people with eating disorders, people in recovery from eating disorders, clinicians, researchers, and I have found it to be just an unparalleled space for engagement, and I'd like to make it a space for engagement for even more people. So that's part of what I'm going to talk about tonight, is how to make this space a bit more democratic, a little bit less white, and a little bit less straight and heterosexual and able-bodied and thin-bodied. So just basically how to make the space a bit more democratic for everybody to be able to engage. Because as I'll talk about, it's not really safe for everybody to share their stories online, and I want to make it a space where that is possible. So, social media. There's a lot of debate about social media. Some people love it, some people hate it. I think you might be surprised to know that I kind of come out somewhere in the middle. I do love social media for a number of reasons, but as I said, it's not perfect. Unfortunately, a lot of the research about eating disorders in social media tends to focus on primarily the negative aspects as opposed to the positive. And I think that what's important is to recognize that there can be negative aspects, but also really focus on those positive aspects as things that we can leverage and ways that we can work through the use of social media to kind of overcome a couple of the negative things to get to more of a positive space with social media. So some of the things that people have pointed out is that social media can be an isolating factor. People will point to social media as a space where, people are no longer talking in person, people are, always on their phones, people don't connect person to person anymore, people are always, trolling, they say, so going on and attacking people online because they're anonymous. And while those things do happen, there are a number of positive things about social media as well, and as I'll talk about, it can be a great connector for folks. It can be a great way for particularly introverted people like myself to connect with people who I would never have talked to in person. So I have found that more people know me from Twitter when I go to a conference than know me from any other space. And especially as an academic, it's a great way of reaching people who I would never reach otherwise. So I mean, when I get stuck in academia, I'm in this ivory tower mindset. And I'm talking to people who speak this odd language of sociology and psychology and philosophy that I speak. And sometimes it's easy to get wrapped up in that and forget the fact that your research has real impact and has real people involved in it. And I have found Twitter to be a really good tool for kind of stepping out of the ivory tower and sharing my research in a way that makes people challenge me, it makes people give me new insights, it connects me to other researchers. We can have a real conversation that's ongoing and connecting. And in some of my research, I've also found that other people with eating disorders and parents of people with eating disorders have found social media to be a similar space. So a space to really engage with each other and connect to people without having to necessarily go find those people in real life. Because sometimes, it might be hard to just go into your community center and shout from the rooftops, I have an eating disorder, or I have a child with an eating disorder and I really want somebody else to talk to who's been through this. And I think that online you can find those communities, and especially nowadays, you can just Google search, support for parents with eating disorders, and you'll come up with the Families Empowered and Supporting Eating Disorders. You might even come up with NIED. So you might come up with different people who you can connect with, and sometimes I found that people, just by sharing their stories, feel like they've made a connection. And so that's my favorite part about social media. But again, we can't ignore the negative aspects, and I do think to a certain extent we could call it a little bit isolating at times, and as I'll talk about, some of the research does highlight some potentially negative ramifications. So no matter how you frame it, social media is a huge part of our lives. I know that I spend a ton of time on social media, and I've gained this reputation as like live tweeter de facto. In fact, I'm actually live tweeting this as I'm talking right now by pre-scheduling tweets. So this is something that I do when I give talks, is I pre-schedule tweets using TweetDeck. So basically I go in and I highlight the key points of my talk, and those get sent out to Twitter at regular intervals as I talk. And I have found this is an amazing way of making sure that people get from my talk what I hope they get from my talk. Because sometimes I'm a little less clear when I'm talking. And so I can really write out what I'm thinking, and it also is a great preparation tool. So just kind of thinking about how I'm framing things, what type of language I'm using, because as I said before, again, I get caught up in the ivory tower, and sometimes I tend to use jargon, and I've been called out for that before on social media, and I try to take it gracefully. So this is my Twitter page, and it's been building over the past couple years, and as I said, I've been in the business of trying to convince other people to join Twitter. I also recently engaged in a project called 365 Days of Selfies, where I took pictures of myself in various poses and settings over 365 days and accompanied those with quotes. So in those pictures, I was trying to kind of reclaim the selfie as an artistic project. And it was also a great way to connect with people and to share kind of different quotes about the way that I was feeling, what was going on in my day, and kind of speak back to this selfie culture where everyone says, oh, selfies are just about self-indulgence. It's just about using Facetune, this app that makes your features look all shiny. But I tried to be as honest as possible on this space and just kind of talk about how life is not always beautiful. And I think it's important at this point to also point out the spaces of privilege I occupy and how this interacts with my social media use. So I am a white, thin, heterosexual, cisgender woman, and these give me privileges online that other people don't always enjoy. And so I don't tend to face as much quote-unquote trolling as other people who occupy different positions might. And I think the best example that I can think about is I was at the Weight Stigma Conference in Iceland in 2014, and I noticed when I was live tweeting, there were a couple of people who were tweeting back saying really negative things about people in larger bodies. And when I talked later with some activists who lived in larger bodies, they were saying that they get hundreds of those tweets every single day, whether they're at that conference or not. And so that was really illustrative to me, because it's even just my very appearance and my very presence online protects me from some of the negative side effects of social media and kind of colors the way that I think about social media and the way that the space operates for me. I also have the privilege of being able to call myself recovered from an eating disorder, and people believe me automatically because of the way that my body looks and the way that I was diagnosed and the fact that I could access treatment fairly easily because of my spaces of privilege. Which is not at all to say that recovery was easy. Recovery was definitely not an easy process, but it was easier for me than it was for some other people who face a number of barriers. So people who are told that they don't have legitimate eating disorders because they don't fit that stereotype of the thin young white girl with an eating disorder. So those people might face barriers that might make it harder for them to believe that they have a legitimate problem and access support. And some of these things get reproduced online as well. So it's not like online is some mecca of complete inclusion, but that's the direction that I'd like to see it going in. So as I mentioned, social media can be a space for enacting social justice as well as a place for building social support. And I'm going to offer a couple of examples that show how this might happen over the course of the talk. So I'm going to offer the example of a petition that I put together called the Unquantified Self that got Apple to remove their step counter, as well as the petition for the repeal of the Healthy Menu Choices Act that I recently did, a project that I did on blogs for community building for eating disorder parents, and a recent project that I did that looked at eating disorder recovery on Instagram. So in case you're not super into social media, I thought I'd give you a bit of a rundown about kind of what it is and what different platforms people use. I'm sure this might be boring for some of you who do use a lot of social media, but it might be informative as well. So I've referenced already Facebook and Twitter, Instagram. These are the ones that people commonly know. So by the numbers, these are huge networks. So Facebook has 1.86 billion users. That grew from their very small beginnings of about 100 million active users in 2008. So that's a pretty quick growth, like from 100 million to 1.86 billion. Like that's enormous boom in use. And originally Facebook was just a tool for college students who were kind of looking for other people who went to their college. And it's grown to be just this space that is populated by, you know, your aunt and your sister and your dog. And Instagram is also a very large social media network, and it was founded a lot later. So Facebook was founded in 2004, was opened up to a larger public in 2004. But Instagram was around 2009 that it became popular, and right now Instagram has 600 million users. Twitter is a little bit smaller and it's a little bit more niche. So Twitter has about 319 million users currently. It grew similarly to Facebook and was founded around the same time. But Twitter tends to be a place that not everybody's super comfortable with. So on Twitter, you're going to send out a 140 character tweet. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that limit. I have found, however, you can write a novel on Twitter. You just have to thread your tweets. So I will like write out an essay essentially, and then just like go copy paste in 140 character blocks. So as long as you know how to thread your tweets, you're good. You can ramble on forever. You don't have to contain yourself in 140 characters. But it is more of a space that I see being used a lot by academics. I see it being used a lot by kind of groups that are interested in getting information out about a particular cause, as opposed to kind of just your average person. Whereas Facebook might be a place where you connect with people you already know. Twitter tends to be more of a like outward reaching platform. And Instagram is just images. You can add a caption, but the main focus is images. So that's been a really interesting place for researchers interested in eating disorders because of the connection with the image. All of these networks do continue to grow, though some people are like, social media is dying. And I'm like, people are still using Facebook. There are 1.86 billion users, so don't tell me it's dead. So as I mentioned before, there's a predominant assumption that social media and eating disorders have a negative relationship. So there's this idea that media influence, as we know it, just kind of translates to social media influence. So there are a lot of studies that happened kind of in the early 90s that looked at the impact of media on people with eating disorders. And they looked at, you know, internalization of thin ideals. They looked at how people are, you know, comparing themselves to runway models. They looked at how people are comparing themselves to magazines and to celebrities. And these have been taken with a grain of salt in the literature that's come forward more recently that's like, you know what, eating disorders are not just about this thin ideal. Eating disorders are about so much more than body image, and eating disorders are not just about comparing yourself to this amazingly beautiful human on the cover of a magazine. We know with media literacy that we can combat those ideas. We know that media literacy can help us to kind of unpack some of those ideas, and eating disorders still happen. So clearly eating disorders are not just about media, because we have amazing media literacy and still we have eating disorders. So this is something to think about. But still, the assumption kind of prevails in the back of a lot of researchers' minds. And so the natural place for them to go with the social media literature was along the lines of, well, you know, we think media might impact people with eating disorders, so probably social media does too. And there's a point to this as well. There is this idea of comparison culture on social media. There's this idea of competing for likes. There's this idea that you're putting out this version of yourself that is pristinely curated. So a lot of the time what you'll see on social media is not someone's real life. It's just a representation of some of the parts of their life. And so that can be lost on people who are acutely struggling. If you're feeling really anxious and you put up a photo on Instagram that day and you get 0 likes, that's probably going to make your anxiety worse, because you're like, oh my God, nobody likes me. Even if you know that it doesn't actually matter, it might still impact you on a visceral level. And that's what researchers have found. They've really found that it can potentially enforce this kind of social comparison, this idea that, you know, you're dependent on the number of likes that you have, the image that you put out needs to be perfect, otherwise people aren't going to like it. But it's not wholly negative. So they don't find direct correlations between social media and the onset of eating disorders. There are a number of different kind of intermediary factors. And there's also the question of, is it possible that people have anxiety and have depression and have eating disorders, and those people might be more drawn to social media as opposed to the other way around. So it's not necessarily that social media is causing eating disorders or causing anxiety or causing depression. There's a possibility that anxiety and depression and eating disorders are contributing to engagement with social media, because there may be kind of a seeking out of that external validation of yourself. There's also a fear around pro-eating disorder communities online. So one of the things that you might have heard about is pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia spaces online. And Instagram in particular has been really proactive in cracking down around those. So Instagram has banned the hashtags pro-ana, pro-anorexia, pro-mia, and pro-bulimia, and kind of tried to get these spaces off of social media. So what these spaces are places where people share images that are supposed to motivate them to lose weight, places where people talk about eating disorders and kind of the problematics, or I guess the lifestyle, quote unquote, of an eating disorder. But those spaces also are sometimes places where people are really honest. And so we need to be thinking about, when that community goes away, are people just going to seek out community somewhere else and call it something different? So just because you crack down on something doesn't mean that it goes away. For better or for worse, people are going to find places where they're going to either encourage or discourage each other from engaging in eating disorder behaviors. So none of these places are completely negative and none of these places are completely positive. There are definitely things that go on that are super problematic in pro-ana and pro-mia communities, but those things are going to happen somewhere else if they're not happening there. So we really need to be focusing on how we can provide support for those people who are going to those communities, as opposed to just shutting down their one space where they can talk and be vulnerable. So I think it's really important for us to be building up supports as we monitor social media. So if we're going to take something away, we need to put something in its place that might potentially be a bit more of a safe space for people to engage. There are also a number of trends on social media that I absolutely hate. I detest them and I want them to go away yesterday. And the first one of these is Fitspiration. So I could go on all day about Fitspiration and how much I hate it. But Fitspiration has basically kind of co-opted this idea of Thinspiration that operated in pro-ana and pro-mia communities and taken it to be about fitness. So instead of being about thinness, there's this changed focus to be about, being toned and being fit and being fast and strong, which can be amazing, and it's great to be fast and strong and powerful. But when it becomes about what that looks like, that can be a real problem. And when that becomes a hashtag that gets used, that can really just kind of like co-opt this whole eating disorder pro-ana space into something else that looks a little bit more socially acceptable. So we live in a society where thin-toned bodies are the norm, or normative. They're supposed to be normative. They're supposed to be what you're aspiring to. And so people don't see that as necessarily so negative. And so people might not be so keen to jump in and be like, hey, what you're doing is problematic if it's causing you distress. They might be like, wow, look at you go. You're so strong. Like, be strong, be fit, be toned. And you might be struggling inside. That said, perhaps there are people in these communities who are very happy with what they're doing. And I think it's always important to look at that side too, because some people do take great joy in doing fitness. Some people do take great joy in, engaging in certain types of eating. And I don't want to say that those practices are necessarily wrong, but they are wrong when they start to cause you a lot of distress. When they're becoming problematic for you, they're becoming problematic. And it's easy to kind of hide behind the hashtag Fitspiration or clean eating as keeping those practices as very socially normative, very socially acceptable, very socially praised even. And it's hard for people who don't look like that fitness ideal to fit into those communities and to be accepted into those communities, and that's where the problem lies. These communities also tend to be, as I mentioned before, very white. They tend to be very female. They tend to be very straight. They tend to be spaces where you get one picture of what it is to be a human. And if there's one thing that I can say, it's that there is no one way to be a human, right? And so we can't have one representation on our social media outlets about what it is to be a human. So yes, as I mentioned, there is a number of fear-mongering tactics that go on in terms of social media and eating disorders. And as I mentioned before, there is perhaps the increase in peer competitiveness in these spaces, but we can't completely demonize them. There are perhaps increases in body dissatisfaction, but we have to think about that reverse correlation that I talked about, where these things might exist before, or they might exist in other ways if they're not via social media. I have to take a drink. I have a very dry mouth. Does anyone have any questions so far?
What's clean eating? What's the obsessiveness with eating healthy?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for asking. It is basically just the idea that everything that you eat has to be like perfect. It has to be nutritionally ideal somehow. Largely eating like a lot of vegetables and not much else, that kind of thing. Or like the paleo trend you might see as being called clean eating. Just any of these kind of diets that focus on no processed foods, that sort of thing. Yeah.
I just have a question about your presentation. Is it okay for us to take pictures?
Oh,
and
yeah.
share?
I have it being recorded. I'm going to share it on the social media. Yes. Great. Thank you for the question. So I kind of have already hammered this point home, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. But as I just said, there's no one way of being human, and I think when we start to tell that one story, that becomes a problem. That also operates with eating disorders, and as I mentioned, can cause a number of barriers. So the told story about the eating disorder does not mean that it is not ever true. It just means that it's incomplete. So there's this story that somebody with an eating disorder is white. There's a story that somebody with an eating disorder is a woman. There's a story that somebody with an eating disorder is heterosexual and thin and needs immediate medical treatment in an intensive inpatient unit. This is not the only story of a person with an eating disorder. People with eating disorders are men, people with eating disorders are black, people with eating disorders are Latina and trans and all of these different identities. And oftentimes the symptoms of those people get shrugged off by healthcare professionals and get shrugged off by the general public as if they couldn't possibly have an eating disorder because that group must be immune. There's a huge myth around queerness and eating disorders where queer people are not expected to have eating disorders because of that other myth that I talked about eating disorders being all about kind of vain and thinness ideals and kind of appealing to this male gaze that operates in society. So how could somebody who's queer possibly have an eating disorder because they couldn't want to appear to the male gaze? But that's obviously a very, very simplistic conclusion about A, what causes eating disorders, and B, who might suffer from an eating disorder and why they might be suffering from an eating disorder. And so I have found that one of the ways to break these stereotypes is by working with groups who are already doing just that on social media. So one of my favorite groups that I love to talk about are trans folks fighting EDS, and they have been just the most powerful voice in like getting representation into this told story. So as I mentioned, all of these stereotypes that exist around eating disorders get replicated on social media. Somebody like a doctor might go on social media and be like, oh, this is what an eating disorder is. This is the only thing I'm going to look for in my treatment setting. Trans Folks Fighting EDS has just gone in there and they've been like, look, this is false. Like, let's tell our stories. They've shared videos, they've shared resources, they have shared countless hours of free education for people about what it means to be a person who is non-normative, who has an eating disorder. And these stories are incredibly powerful. And they also come to conferences. So this has been amazing too, is that they've teamed up with some researchers and they've been able to get to conferences and live tweet conferences as well. And one of my favorite things about what they do in those spaces is that they'll critique the research that's going on. They'll say, this person got up and they had a sample that was 90% white women. Like, this is not representative of my reality. And I was just sitting there and like, oh gosh, I better be careful in my samples, you know? Like, I better make sure that this isn't what I do. And so I think it's a really nice check for researchers because we pretty much get to do like, you know, whatever population we want. And so I think it's really important that we talk to stakeholders and we talk to people who are suffering when we're figuring out what we're going to research and how we're going to do it. Because if we're not doing research that's helpful to those people, then what are we doing? Another one is Nalgona Positivity Pride, and they don't do just eating disorders, but they also talk about eating disorders and a lot of the time in Latina and Latinx people. And they have some amazing articles up online that I often share that have to do with eating disorders. So one of the interesting things about both of these groups is that, as I mentioned before, they're doing free education essentially. Like, Twitter can be an amazing place to share resources that you can then seek out, and then you don't have to be putting the burden on people who are different to be educating you all the time. Because I think this is something that I've really learned is, as a privileged person, like, I don't want to always be going to like my black friend and saying, hey, will you tell me about intersectionality? Like, will you tell me about what it's like to be in your shoes? Like, it's nice to ask, but at the same time, it's not really their job to teach me. It's my job to find those resources because they do exist. So as a person of privilege, I find that I need to go and I need to go look at, you know, what podcasts are coming out of the people of color community, what podcasts are coming out of the LGBTQ community, and I need to go listen to those things and read those things and learn as much as I can. and not go kind of asking one person to represent this entire group, because there are so many differences within those groups as well. So that's the idea of intersectionality, the idea that, you know, we don't just have one identity, we have many identities and those intersect. So you might be a person of color who might be queer, you might be a person who is a man, and you might also have an eating disorder. These are different identities that intersect and interact and form our experiences. There's also been a campaign through the American Eating Disorder Association called Marginalize Ed, and that's been sharing the stories of people who've been marginalized who have eating disorders, just to try to get the word out there again that eating disorders happen to anybody, basically. I always make notes and I never follow them, so I'm just looking through to make sure I didn't miss anything. So as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, one of the things that can get in the way of making the online space a social justice space is just the whiteness of social media in general. So what I mean is that, as I mentioned before, privilege impacts this space. So I can say certain things on social media that other people might not be able to say because they might not be taken seriously, they might be attacked on the basis of one of their identities, and they might be, you know, shut out of that space and told that their stories don't matter. Which is an unfortunate reality of the space as such, but something that, you know, we need to think about as we're moving forward. Like, how do we make this not as white of a space? How do we make this a more inclusive space? So I think the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health has been doing some awesome work around this right now, and we're kind of trying to work beyond this very, very white paradigm that we all operate in our organizations. There's also the idea of tone policing, so the idea that the way that you say something can get really, can get a reaction out of people. It can mean that, you know, if you say something that sounds really angry and you're a black person, it might get taken in a certain way because there's this idea that, you know, the angry black woman trope. So you might get shut down and people might get defensive and get their guard up and not allow you to speak what is your truth. So it's a tricky space to navigate for people who don't kind of fit the norm. There's also the idea that sometimes you'll hear calls on social media to just share your story. Just share your story, just put it out there. And I think that's amazing, and I think we all need to be telling our stories, but I think we need to recognize that that's not safe for everybody, and I think we need to make it a safer space for everybody by when people do get vulnerable and share their stories, we need to be very encouraging of that and accepting of their realities, even if they don't look like ours. And then I think at the same time, we need to be using social media not just as a space for storytelling and keeping it at the individual level, but also lobbying policymakers, lobbying for funding, kind of making sure that we recognize that until we make changes in society that make more bodies welcome, it's still going to be hard to share the story. So, how do people make change for eating disorders? I've done a little bit. I could have done so much more, but there's only so many hours in the day, and I'm very young, so I have lots of time. This is something I'm working on. I'm working on it. So the first kind of like foray that I took into trying to actually make change in eating disorders was in 2014. And I did what might be called #activism campaign called the Unquantified Self. So I have an iPhone. Unfortunately, it is usually attached to my person at all times. Unless I have lost it, which Alex will tell you happens all the time. So I noticed one day that my steps were being tracked. I was really affronted by this. I was like, okay, I don't really want to know how many steps I'm taking a day. This is going to be super problematic for me with my history. I just think I should turn this off. So I went to turn it off, and I realized that you couldn't turn it off. There was no option to delete this app. There was no option to have it stop tracking my steps, and I was horrified. I was just like, what's gonna happen? I called my mom, and I was like, Mom, I can't turn off the step tracker. Do I have to get rid of my phone? What is gonna happen? So I ended up putting together a campaign called the Unquantified Self, and I got people to send in feedback to Apple via Twitter and also via their feedback site, saying that this can be problematic for people with a history of eating disorders because they might get fixated on the number and find themselves slipping back into behaviors. So we were pretty persistent. I got some people to write blog posts about it, got a lot of people to tweet about it, got people to feedback about it. Lo and behold, the next iOS update, you could remove the step counter. I like to believe that this was partially because of me, even though I know it was probably just a bug, but like I did feel some sort of sense of, I made a change, this is the space I can use. And I was like, it's totally coincidence, but I don't even care. So that was kind of my first foray into it, and that made me feel really good, and it made me feel like, oh wow, like actually sometimes if you speak to the big powers, they'll make a change because they don't want to hear your complaints over and over again incessantly. And I'm very persistent, if nothing else. So inspired by this, I have continued to engage in social media as a space of trying to lobby corporations, lobby government, all of these places to make changes. So in 2016, I was approached by a number of people who had been suffering from eating disorders and asked to put together a petition to repeal the Healthy Menu Choices Act. So this is an act that recently came into effect in January, in case you haven't been to a chain restaurant lately, where chain restaurants with more than 20 locations are required to put the calories on the menu, at least as large, if not larger than the price. So some people love this idea. I have even talked to people with eating disorders who prefer this idea because they say that then it allows them to have more of a choice because they know how many calories are in things and that's helpful for them. But a lot of people who I talked to who were in recovery and who were actively trying to combat those thoughts found it super problematic and found that they couldn't go into those restaurants anymore because they were confronted with this number. They had no choice but to look at it. And people were like, well, why don't you just not look at it? And I'm like, it's the same with the step counter. Like, you can hide it behind as many walls as you want and you're still gonna know it's there. So especially when it's right in your face, when you have to look at it to look at the price, if that's a fixation for you, you're gonna look at it. And so I put together this petition geared toward Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, and started to get people to sign. I looked at the research and also found that there's very little evidence to support this move in the first place. So even if we assume that it's a laudable goal to reduce people's intake, which I have issues with in itself, this isn't even doing that necessarily. So a lot of what the research says is that sometimes it'll reduce people's intake at that particular meal, but it's not going to necessarily reduce their intake overall for the day. So they might eat less of that meal and then go binge at a later meal because they've restricted earlier in the day. They might eat more at that meal and then restrict later in the day. So there are a number of different behaviors that can go on. And basically what this act made it seem is that, you know, obesity and eating disorders were treated as if they were at some separate ends of a continuum, and that obesity is necessarily bad. Obesity necessarily involves binge eating and eating more than you're supposed to, when we know that that's not necessarily true. It can be caused by a number of different factors, and people of all different body sizes can be healthy. So the use of the word healthy in the choice is questionable. And the whole act itself is questionable. So up to this point, it's received over 1,000 signatures. Unfortunately, what I have learned is that the government of Ontario does not honor online petitions as a reason to make policy change. You have to go around with a pen and paper and get people to sign something. So I find this really interesting, especially in light of this conversation about social media. Because the reason that they don't honor it is because they don't take social media kind of seriously as a space where people are being honest and people are, you know, sharing their right stories, and you know, they're not just going in with multiple accounts and signing it multiple times. There's a very big distrust of social media, I think, but how hard would it be to actually go around and get like 1,000 signatures on paper? And I mean, not that that's not worth doing, but it's interesting in terms of what the government honors. I also learned a couple of things about interacting with mainstream media and how we can use social media as a space to fill in the gaps that get left in mainstream media stories. So I did about 15 interviews, I would say, with CTV, CBC, Metro News, The Record, all different places. Because once one news outlet thinks something is interesting, all the other ones start to find it interesting and start to call you. And suddenly you have a camera crew at your house in the middle of the day. So I learned that I would have these great conversations with people, and I would be like, you know, it's one thing to say, go deal with your triggers and like have an environment that is trigger-free, that is not trigger-free and you're able to deal with. But you can't just say that and then not provide people with support. So I started to try to have the conversation about how, if we're going to say that people need to be dealing with their triggers, we need to be stepping up funding and access to treatment. Because if you're going to leave people in this circumstance where they're encountering a trigger, you can't expect them to just go deal with that on their own. They have a mental illness. It's a serious mental illness. They can't just kind of buck up and feel better like by talking to their dog about it. They need help. They need somebody to support them. And so we need to be providing more of that, more affordable treatment, and we need to be reducing those barriers to treatment that I've talked about. So I'd have this giant conversation, and then the article would come out, and it would be like, X number of calories in a poutine. And I was just like, no, like I can't even share this with people a lot of the time. Like there were times when I did not share the article that I was interviewed for because I was like, in the article there are large numbers of calories associated with items and I don't want to put that on people. You know, I don't feel comfortable sharing that into that space. So I used social media to talk about these things that were going on in the conversations that weren't being shared. Radio became my favorite thing ever because you could talk live with somebody and you could say your whole piece. You could say that piece about treatment. And I tried to use the space to have those conversations when I could and then to share those. But when I couldn't do that, I tried to use social media to fill in some of the gaps around the conversations that were occurring. And while I might not have reached as many people, I hope that I kind of expanded the conversation even a little bit. So I also learned that a lot of people in the world know like nothing about eating disorders and they don't even see it as a serious mental illness, which I think I knew, but like I don't often encounter because I surround myself by so many amazing people who know a lot about eating disorders and who understand eating disorders. And I think that this was really eye-opening for me in terms of how much work we still have to do in terms of getting eating disorders recognized as serious mental illnesses and really, really working systemically to change the type of access that we have. So it was like a good, bad scenario, and I'm still kind of unresolved. But I actually wanted to read out like a couple of comments too that people left on the petition because this was the one place where I would say do read the comments. So I'm just going to read these because I'll get them wrong, but this is what somebody wrote. The first time I encountered a menu with a calorie count, I was in the middle of my battle with anorexia and bulimia. It was on a vacation to New York City with my parents. As soon as I saw what I considered massive numbers beside the food, I panicked. The room was spinning and I thought, I can't eat anything, this will kill me if I eat anything. I ended up purchasing a salad, a nightmare salad that I could only conceive of as literal poison rather than something with nutritional value. When we left that restaurant, I was still having a panic attack. I fainted on the floor of the subway station. So when I think about this law, I think about lying on a filthy subway floor, thinking I'm going to die. In the decades since that moment, I've avoided looking at calories. I've gone to absurd lengths not to see them, because as soon as those numbers are in my head, everything else goes out the window. Calories by themselves do not equal nutritional information. Only nutritional pamphlets that these sorts of restaurants already offer provide information about sugar content, fat and trans fats, protein, vitamins, etc. These materials should always be available, but a calorie display is misleading. Many foods, while high in calories, can also be far more nutritious. That should be the goal of a law like this, encouraging people to nourish their bodies, not to make them into mindless calorie counters like us, or former people like us, in my case, hopefully. So comments like that really galvanized me to keep doing this work because I think that sharing those comments with people who don't empathize with eating disorders is a really impactful way of kind of spreading knowledge about what we need to do in terms of changing the conversation about eating disorders. It's a scary world out there in terms of people's comments on these articles, and the only place that I'd recommend reading the comments are on the petition itself, not on any of the articles that have been about it, because people are quite mean. Which is fine, because I'm used to people being mean now, apparently. I did cry one time, just once. Yes, so moving on to, does anyone have any questions about the healthy calorie count menu thing before we move on to the next example? While I take a break to get more water? Yeah?
How can we sign that petition?
Yeah, so if you Google Healthy Menu Calorie Choices Act, it's a lengthy name, and then change.org, it should come up. Yeah. I'm still hoping to share all the comments with Kathleen Lynn. I was thinking I'd just go through and copy paste all the comments into a document and then send her a physical copy of it because I think it's a real testament. There are several hundred comments on it that talk about the impact that this law is having. And I mean, I love doing everything with NIED, who's so lovingly allowed me to do this today. And we also went to Ottawa and we were talking to the government about kind of subsequent things that might happen in terms of nutrition information on food. So this has had some positive impacts, just in terms of getting that recognized and getting the eating disorder voice heard in decisions that get made about menus and nutrition, which surprisingly we were not at all involved in before. So yeah. So now I'll talk a little bit about some research examples. So those ones I consider more like advocacy examples because I kind of just did them because I felt passionate about something, not because I wanted to do a research project. Although I have to say the comments would make an amazing research project, but that's besides the point. I will do that later. I have, as I said, many years. I'm trying to play the long game now. So I did do an analysis in, I believe it was 2013, of blog posts written by parents of people supporting people with eating disorders. So these are parents who were engaged in family-based treatment, which is known as one of the evidence-based forms of treatment, mainly for adolescents who are under the age of 16, who've never been hospitalized, and whose disorders have been onset within the last 3 months. So it's a very parent-intensive intervention. It involves essentially becoming the main caregiver for the child, providing all of the meals, working with the therapist as well, but also kind of always being around and making sure that the child does not have a role in preparing the food. You just kind of present the food to them, and you essentially have to be, that's kind of your full-time job. It becomes your full-time job. So it's an amazingly effective intervention for some people who are able to do it and do it with trained clinicians who are following the manual. But it's really hard. It's very, very hard to watch your child struggle with an eating disorder under any circumstances, and it's very hard if you are the one providing a lot of the care for that eating disorder. No matter how amazing your therapist is, it's going to be a challenge to support somebody with an eating disorder. So what I found was that parents were turning to blogs as a place of finding social support. So they were writing these blogs about what their experiences were, and they were reaching out to other people who were struggling with similar things as a way to connect. So as I mentioned before, it's sometimes kind of hard to find people who are struggling in your direct vicinity. So it can be hard to find a support group in your town. You know, like I remember, like not to out you, Mom, but it was hard for you to find somewhere to talk to people who were going through a similar thing, and that was really hard.
There was nowhere.
Yeah, like there was nowhere for you to go at the time, right? Because that was like 8 years ago or whatever, and there weren't a lot of support groups that existed. So what these parents did is, instead of kind of suffering in silence, they decided to reach out and create a blog. So I found these blogs on the Families Empowered and Supporting Eating Disorders site, and I basically analyzed 138 blog posts that were written by mothers of parents who were struggling, of kids who were struggling. So what I found primarily was that they used it just for this. They used it as a space to connect, to chronicle their experiences and their struggles, and also just to provide practical support. So like, even when you have a great therapist, the therapist has many clients, and there are times when you might have questions and you can't reach your therapist. So they would be asking things about like how to put more calories in the food, how to make sure that, you know, what to do if your child is really, really resisting, like just practical ways of working through. And parents would comment on each other's blogs, and they would say, like, I've been there, like I know exactly what you're struggling with right now, like here are some strategies that I used. Because the great thing was, it was kind of this knowledge exchange over a period of time. So some of the people were really new to FBT, they were really new to supporting someone with an eating disorder, and other people were veterans, you know. Maybe their kid had recovered too, so they could provide that kind of hope. They could be like, look, like, you can get through this, like you can, we are in this together. And just, this was just an amazing space that I found, and analyzing the blogs was one of my favorite projects that I've ever done because of the amount of support that they were providing each other in this online space. So to me, this was really an example of how social media and kind of online engagement can be a really, really powerful tool for connection. So that study is published in very short form. It was originally 7,000 words, and I had to cut it down to 2,000, which was something I was very sad about. But yes. So in terms of other research projects, another one of my favorite projects over the past couple of years has been my hashtag Instagram recovery one. It used to be called hashtag goals, but I presented that title to my advisor, and she's like, did they use that hashtag? Like, what is that about? And I'm like, it's just like a funny joke using social media that you don't get. But people wouldn't get it either. But I thought it was funny. But now it's just called hashtag eating disorder recovery because that's simpler. So I completed that very recently, and I analyzed 1,056 posts on social media, on Instagram in particular, that were under the hashtag eating disorder recovery. So the reason that I wanted to do this was because I am fascinated with this Instagram space that's acting as a recovery community for some folks. So if you go look under the hashtag eating disorder recovery, you will find thousands and thousands of posts, primarily of people's food and people's kind of transformation. And I thought that this was really fascinating. I was wondering, you know, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this both? As per usual, my answer was both. But I just thought that it would be really interesting to look at those images and look at what people were putting in those images, and maybe why they chose to put certain things in the images and to leave other things out. And also what captions they were using. So, you know, like, are they providing a long example of what their day was like, or are they just describing what's in the image? So I looked at these over the course of several months. I actually did take a step back and hire some research assistants to help me, which was amazing. And I was like, delegation is the future. Because 1,056 images is a lot of images to look at. So I basically created this big table, and it was describe what's in the image, describe the comments, describe the caption, and then I looked at all of those. And once my research assistants gave me back these beautiful tables, I was able to look at what was most common. So what I found was people did most often post pictures of food, and they most often put pictures of food that were fairly pristinely curated. I don't know if any of you are familiar with food blogs, but basically people just kind of post these amazingly beautiful recipes. And they looked a lot like that. Like a lot of them were pretty much, could be taken from a food blog. And I was like, wow, these people are very invested in making their food look good. And I thought that was really interesting in the context of eating disorder recovery. So I wondered about that kind of perfection around recovery that gets kind of represented a lot. Because while the representation of eating disorders is limited, so is the representation of recovery. And there's this kind of idea that once you're in recovery, you are like perfect with food. You're like the most amazing person with food. You have this beautiful diet that is like ideal for everybody. And it's like, what if you just can't really be bothered that much and food is just more functional for you? Like, which is the case for some people. And I think both need to be okay, but it's interesting how the only one that we really see, because that's the only people who bother to post, are those ones that are quite pristinely curated. And so I wonder about this representation that we get about recovery that doesn't represent everybody's reality, and it doesn't represent kind of how imperfect recovery can be, and how there needs to be room to struggle and to say, like, hey, can you help me out? I'm struggling. Like, I need somebody right now, as opposed to just like, my bowl of oats is beautiful, it's sitting in the sunshine this morning. I did, however, find that some people did use it as a space where they could connect when they were struggling, and really reach out to other Instagram users. And oftentimes you would have upwards of several hundred likes and comments on singular images. So this is clearly a very active community. People are engaging with this hashtag a lot to share their stories. And again, like the blogs, it can act as a space of kind of like helping each other out. And like some people would post a quote saying like, I really think I need to go back to treatment, and the comments would be overwhelmingly positive in terms of like, yes, you do that, like that's a great idea. And I think Instagram is a particularly interesting space for that as well, because they recently put in a policy that you can kind of direct somebody to support if you think that they're struggling. So Instagram, I think, has been pretty proactive around mental health, and so that also made this a really interesting space to look at. The way that bodies were represented in Instagram recovery was a little bit interesting as well. So there were a lot of before and after pictures, which is something that is hotly contested in the eating disorder world, particularly because I'm not really sure that it's productive for people to see the before picture of somebody like while they're really suffering from an eating disorder, because it reinforces that stereotype that to be taken seriously you need to be hyper emaciated and you need to be a certain look, when people of all sizes can be struggling very acutely. And so sometimes if you see that image that is representative of what it looks like, quote unquote, to be sick, you might be like, oh gosh, I don't look like that, I might not be sick enough, which is so not true, right? Like anybody can be sick enough and needs to get treatment. And also the after pictures can be problematic as well. So if you're just showing bodies that are between a BMI of 20 and 24, that are white, that are women, again, you're missing a huge swath of the population. And you'll even find in the eating disorder recovery literature, there's this odd kind of category where you're supposed to be recovered between a BMI of 20 and 24. And it's like, well, what happens if you're bigger than a BMI of 24? Are you no longer recovered? Like, that's ridiculous to me. Like, you can be recovered at any body size that is your natural body size. And I think sometimes when we don't see that on Instagram, we might kind of take that as an issue. And it's like, when do kind of these dominant ideas around what it means to be a healthy person start applying to a person in eating disorder recovery? Because there's very different idea and set of practices that operate for people in recovery and people kind of in the mainstream, where people in the mainstream are being told like, eat less, exercise more, and people in recovery are being told eat more, exercise less, and it's like that gets really confusing when your body doesn't look the way that you are told it's supposed to look by society. So overall, there was also limited socioeconomic, racial, and gender diversity on the images that were represented. How I know about the socioeconomic one, because you're like, how do you know? Like, you can't really tell how rich people are by looking at Instagram. But like, it's the types of foods that get pictured, I think, primarily. So things like Quest bars are very popular, like bars, nutrition bars that cost about $2 or $3 a pop. Like name brand ice cream, that sort of stuff, can really kind of play into this idea that you somehow need to be rich to be recovered or have had an eating disorder, which I thought was really interesting. And out of the entire data set of the 1,056 images, I think there were 2 men, which is interesting because men get eating disorders too and deserve to have a voice in recovery as well. Right, so I'm just speeding right on through. Does anyone have any questions about that study? I'm gonna take more water.
Can I ask a challenging question?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can, Karen.
Can you, since you are, can you talk a little bit about your recent blog?
Which one?
Like your recent blog adventure that you've done?
Oh, yeah.
And how that relates to images or pictures of food?
Yeah, definitely. So the funny thing about me is that I would label myself a foodie. I'm a person who's very interested in like beautiful food. I like to make food. I bake when I'm stressed, which is more often than I would like. So I'm often baking, and Alex's coworkers get the spoils because we can't possibly eat all of it ourselves. So I find baking to be like a space where I can really like meditate and think on things. And so I used to blog at a blog called Science of Eating Disorders that is now inactive, and so I've started blogging on my own about kind of my reflections on feminism, my reflections on recovery, my reflections on eating disorders. And I decided to do that also in a semi-food blog type way by showing like what I'm thinking about while I'm making something and eating it. So I think for me it's about like while I'm cooking I'm thinking about things, and it's usually about something related to research because I'm a giant nerd. And so I thought that I could combine those two. But I recently, like the first blog that I chose to write was actually about this idea of like how to make space for that. Because I think like when I was in early recovery, people would problematize this idea that I would engage with food. So people were like, I wanted a job at Second Cup because Second Cup is like my second home and I just love coffee a lot. And I remember my treatment team being like, are you sure, like, have you thought about this in relation to, like, you'll be around food all the time, right? And I'm like, I hadn't really thought about it, I just really like coffee, but okay. So it was really like I wasn't allowed to enjoy food, I just had to treat it as like fuel. I just had to treat it as like something that I ate at a certain time of day in a very rigid structure, which was really confusing to me because that was also what my eating disorder told me that I needed to do. And so I've, like, over the past 8 years, I've been really thinking about, like, what is my relationship with food and, like, how do I define that for myself? And I think that this idea that I might somehow enjoy baking could still be problematized by some people as an obsession with food when it's not necessarily that, right? Like, it's about making something out of nothing. I think of it much like the way I think about writing, right? Like, you just pull things and all of a sudden you have this, like, beautiful piece. Like, I think of them in a very similar way. But yeah, it could be problematized by some people. People could be like, oh, that girl, she's still thinking about food all the time. It's like, well, maybe that's true, but is that bad? But I also think there needs to be space for people who don't care. People who are like, I'm gonna grab whatever because like I just need to get food in my belly and like out the door and I just don't want to think about it. And so I think both of those things need to be able to exist side by side. And so the task of my blog as I move forward will to be to make sure that I'm not kind of like making the conversation only about those who like discover this extreme joy in food, because I would never want anyone to feel like they had to do that. And I think similarly about the Instagram project, in terms of maybe some of these people are taking great joy in chronicling their food. Maybe they're like, I can't believe that I was at this place where I just like was so terrified of food, and now I'm like, I can eat a piece of cake and feel great about it. Like, so I'm like, I want them to be able to celebrate that, but I also don't want that to be the only representation that we get. And unfortunately, the thing is, the more kind of I don't care as much about food is harder to represent, right? So people aren't necessarily gonna put it under the hashtag eating disorder recovery if they're like out with friends doing, shopping or whatever brings them joy. So it's hard to kind of have both of those pictures out there because probably what's more imageable would be the enjoyment side. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a good point that like people could be equally posting like eating recovery and doing a hashtag for that, and then also having like another hashtag for some other cause or some other dimension of things that you don't get the full picture of that person and where they are in the recovery. So it's so it's neat to be able to hold a space for both, but at the same time being cautious.
Yeah, and it's hard, and I think there's this real tendency to like, even though we know social media isn't reality and we know that like everything that's posted on Instagram is not representative of someone's whole life, I think there's still a tendency to like read into what people are posting. You know, I think that's a real danger that if we're not like super cautious of like every time we're looking at something being like, like this is, I'm sure something else happened in this person's day. It can be hard to see the whole reality. So I think that's something to be really aware of. So I'm glad you asked the question. Thank you, Karen. Challenging questions.
That's no problem.
So what is social media good for? I really want to sing that song. It's like, whoa. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. No, it's good for some things. So I think that it's really good for building communities of support. That would be my number one. So even though it's imperfect in so many ways, some people do really find it a great space for connection, particularly the recovery communities, though, as I mentioned, those can be limited in terms of who's welcomed into that space. But I found the Parent Project particularly compelling in this instance to kind of show how people can like build connections where they didn't exist before. I also think generating awareness about eating disorders in general. So when we think back to the Healthy Menu Choices Act, we can think about how I was able to have some conversations in places where I might not have been welcomed in to talk about eating disorders before, and with people who wouldn't normally care at all about eating disorders, and even go to government and talk about eating disorders in a space where they weren't aware of it before. I think sometimes for breaking stereotypes, though, there's also the danger of reinforcing stereotypes. So I think particularly about trying to lift up the voices of marginalized groups, and thinking about times when I need to step back and leave space for people who are marginalized to tell their stories. So I've actually been thinking a lot lately about when it's useful to share my story of recovery and when it's just not useful anymore. Because my story does look like the normative story in many ways, and so sometimes it's better for me to not tell that story. Not to deny that I had that experience, but just as a way to like maybe make space for somebody else whose story is a little bit more like different and needs to be shared and needs to be given airtime and respect. Also broadening the conversation between mainstream media limits. So as I said before, sometimes even when people are talking to people who are like eating disorder experts, not that I consider myself an expert, but like I know some stuff about eating disorders, and sometimes people ask me questions about them. But I think those interviews only get parts of the interview, and so it's really nice to be able to use Twitter or Facebook or whatever to fill in the gaps and just say like, hey, I did this interview. They only took like 2 lines, but here's what else I said. Maybe that's also important to talk about. So there are, as I said, a number of drawbacks, namely trolls, and I wish they were that huge in real life, but they are not. I think I've really drilled this point home, so I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, but communities of support can be limited in terms of access for those who don't fit the stereotypes. It can be really hard to kind of enter into that recovery community if you don't fit the norm, because you might get hate, you might get banished. It's a possibility, it can happen. Online trolling is huge and really sad and really hurtful sometimes. Like people will say mean stuff, even to me, and I am protected by, as I said, so many spaces of privilege. Sometimes it still hurts, and sometimes I still cry when I get that, and I think that marginalized folks get that a lot more than I do. As I mentioned before as well, it's not always taken seriously. Social media isn't always taken seriously by anybody, by researchers, by policymakers, by funders. It's seen as something kind of fluffy, when I think there's a lot of meat to it. And also the possibly negative impacts in terms of social comparisons that I mentioned before. So it is possible that people, even in their knowledge of the fact that it isn't reality, are still comparing themselves to this space and to these people in these spaces who have these seemingly such beautiful lives. And I think in terms of social comparison, it's much like media literacy. You could know that an idealized image is not real, and still it can make you feel bad, I think. Like media literacy is not enough to be immune to these things. It's a start, but it's not enough to be immune. So when I'm thinking about kind of like more the instructional side of like how to use social media for these, what I would say, good purposes, is to really, really just think about who's at the table and who's not at the table. And I think if there are significant swaths of the population that are missing from the conversation, we need to be seriously thinking about how to get them involved. And that means more than just kind of like bringing one person of color to the table on a round table or a tweet chat. We need to be doing it ongoing basis, and we need to be doing it kind of throughout all of our social media platforms. This is not at all easy, but it's something that I think we need to be deeply considering. And I also think that we need to make space for multiple versions of reality, of recovery, and multiple ways of being recovered, and how recovery looks different for every person, and eating disorders look different for every person. And I think that all of those things need to be okay and need to be legitimized and recognized, and not treated as kind of like freak accidents. They are people's realities. I think one of the most impactful things that someone from Trans Folks Fighting EDS ever said to me was, I tweeted something about intersectionality, and a couple other people did too, and somebody tweeted about intersectionality, and they said intersectionality is a useful theory to guide our practice of engaging with multiple experiences of being marginalized. And the person from Trans Folks Fighting EDS said, intersectionality isn't theory, it's my reality. So I think that was a really powerful moment for me, because I was like, this is why it's important to have this person here. Because otherwise we'd just be off on our little academic tangents, like sharing our jargon, and I probably have used tons of jargon tonight, so I apologize if I did that. I promised a woman right before I came that I was not going to use jargon, and I'm sure I have. But I think it's important to engage with stakeholders via social media so that they can call us on that, and they can really be like, yeah, this is not just a theoretical construct, this is my reality, this is my life. So this is really just my take-home message, and I forgot a closing quotes, and that makes me sad. But whose voices are we not hearing? Are we assuming eating disorders don't happen to them? How can we listen more attentively, respond more nimbly, and open more doors? So that's kind of my wrap up. And I finished earlier than I expected, so we have tons of time for discussion. I also forgot to say at the beginning, because I was like eager to get started, I just wanted to thank the National Initiative for Eating Disorders for letting me do this talk tonight. And Carly's here representing the National Initiative. So
Hi everyone. Thank you, Andrea. This is a little something from us.
thank you.
So I didn't bring any of our material, just really quickly, and then we can kind of continue to discuss with Andrea. But if you follow us on social media, we have a couple more symposiums coming up, and we are very thankful to have Andrea as a big help with lots of different projects for NIED. So thank you, and we're very happy to support and hear your wisdom. So I have a question. So as part of NIED, we try to do this. How do we do a better job of this? As you know, we are making a lot of change for a small organization, and Nikki is our social media person. We've got quite a good social media presence. Like, do you have any tips for us?
Oh gosh, I think NIED does an amazing job personally,
Okay.
and I'm not just saying that. Like,
Okay.
I think that I've always found NIED's social media presence to be very open, and I think that's key. Like, I find that sometimes organizations tend to kind of toe one particular line, but I find that NIED is quite inviting in their presence, and I think that's important, right? Like, you're not just kind of saying like, tell your story, but only if you're like a productive human now. You know what I mean? You're kind of like, talk to us about your experiences, and let's talk about how to move forward. And one of the things that I really appreciate about NIED's social media is the focus on systems, and the focus on the fact that we need to be like getting more funding for eating disorders, we need to be getting more access to treatment, because I think that's what people want to hear, is that there's actually the possibility of change, right? I think that people get stuck when they feel like people are just telling stories and they're not like using those stories to get action, right? Because I think that one thing that social media can be problematic about is we just talk, like we don't actually act, and I think that NIED really acts, and so that's one of the main reasons why I love NIED and engaging with them. So, and like for instance, like one of the things that NIED does that I guess is a good kind of lesson in general in terms of what I think social media should look like is like reaching out to MPs, like reaching out to members of parliament. And I mean, recently there's been a motion in the House of Commons about the National Strategy for Eating Disorders, which is fantastic. Like, that's action, and when people can see that there's action, they feel hopeful. you know, like when people can see that there's movement and that there's actually kind of like resources being put into this and like people are paying attention. Like we had Sophie Gregoire Trudeau come to a function in Ottawa. Like that's amazing. Like that is movement right there. Like this is not kind of just like fluffy talking about our feelings. Like not that that's a problem. I love talking about my feelings. But I also think that, as you know, but I think like moving and acting is super important too. Yeah.
So maybe we should be more open about more details of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think
More
people
of
would
that
love to
action.
hear it. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment of how to get the word out there and more people talking about it. I know I struggled because it was Andrea's story and I couldn't share my story. But once the person who's willing to share their story is out there, it's been great for when she was on the media with the healthy choice menu thing, my book group was like, oh, I didn't realize that was a thing, and I didn't, but I can now talk about it because Andrea, I could never talk about it before because you have to know that it's their story, and then you have to have the privilege of being able to share that. But getting word out that way, and I have a few little followers, but they will retweet something that I talk about with eating disorders, so that just gets the word out, and the more people in a diverse community hear it, the more people are free to talk about it. And maybe it's not specific and they don't have the actual person that they know personally, but oh yeah, I heard about this, and maybe we should listen to this, and did you think about this? And I think that is sort of grassroots. It's very small, but I think everyone does that and it becomes a bigger
a couple little followers on
I have a
social
few
media.
followers.
I got my mom on Twitter. my mom can tweet. Yep. Thanks, Mom.
We've been talking about making sure that various voices, marginalized voices, are being heard, and I wonder, given that the majority of this group is white, how do we do that? How do we share these voices without trying to be kind of take over, right?
Yeah.
And honoring that, but also not kind of putting more harm onto those marginalized groups in terms of them almost sort of
Like speaking for them?
Speaking for them, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question and something that I don't have a perfect answer for, and something that I continually revisit and think about, especially in light of something that's called ally theater that I start to worry that I'm participating in, and basically that's like being very, very like loud about being an ally, right? So being like, I support like all of this diverse stuff, blah 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 blah, but like almost making it about me, like making it about like, look at me and what a good person I am because I welcome in diversity, and I'm like, it's tempting to do that because it's great to get like gold stars, right? But I think it can't be about that, and I think that I still struggle with how to do the action without making it about me and raise the voice without making it about me. And I think what I've been trying to do is like support in sometimes less loud, like more back channel ways. So like if I see somebody is struggling from a community of like marginalization of some way, like I'll reach out to them like kind of one-on-one and ask like, would this be a helpful moment for me to say something about how you're being excluded right now or the language that's being used that's hurtful? Or would you rather say it yourself? Because sometimes I have found that people would prefer that I say it because they're too anxious to jump into that space, and my privilege can act as like a springboard for a conversation. And other times they're like, no, like I don't want you to like white knight for me. Like I want to say it myself in my own words.
So just asking.
Yeah, I think asking and like connecting with people who do have a certain identity, and asking how they feel about it, and just taking the temperature of that every time.
Yeah, and to that point, like sometimes I have that similar reflection as well, and sometimes my decision is to perhaps share an article without commenting on that, and sometimes I wonder, is that okay, or am I copying out, I guess, too? Like
I don't think so. I think that's a good option, especially if it's written by somebody from that community. They can speak to that so much better than I could. You know what I mean? I think that's a great way to draw attention to the resources that exist, because as I said, they do exist, right? Like not for everything, but I think like with enough digging, we can find resources that support a lot of different communities of difference, and that speak to their experiences. Yeah, so I think that like amplifying those voices that are out there is a great strategy in my opinion. Yeah, and as I said, like I'm definitely not perfect, and I think another thing that I've been getting better at is not being defensive when people call me out for messing up, because I mess up, you know, like I was giving a talk one time and I said something about like women getting the vote, and I mentioned how in Canada like Aboriginal women and Black women didn't get it till after, but I forgot to say that the same happened in the States. Somebody called me out for that and I was like, oh darn, I felt so bad. I was like, because they were like, not all women got the vote in whatever year it was, I forget off the top of my head, I don't know American history. And I was like, I was like, oh God, I sound like a bad person that I didn't acknowledge that. But instead of like going to that defensive place, I was just like, oh yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Like I'm sorry that I missed that. Like, and I think my reaction in that way like can avoid, again, like centering the attention on me and like re-amplify that fact that I missed. Or like if somebody calls out my language, like I once used language like good cop, bad cop, and somebody found that really hurtful given the police violence that has happened recently. And it was again really hard for me to not be like, oh, I didn't mean it that way, like I really didn't mean to cause you harm. Like I was just like, oh gosh, yeah, okay, I'll stop using that if that's hurtful to you. And I think I've been getting better at that, but at first I was like, ooh, like I really don't want to mess up because I hate making mistakes. Really hate it. Hate it a lot. But I have to recognize that I'm going to fail. And I think entering into it with this idea that like I'm gonna mess up and I'm gonna get called out and that's okay, allows me to be called out and for those people's voices to be heard. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question somewhat. Yeah. Other questions? Can be about anything.
I just have a comment to add about that. I think that's one of the fears that people have with social media though, right?
Yeah,
is that, you know, and so I think it must be very challenging for someone that has such a strong following, right? To just be on edge in terms of what can I say, what can I not say, and
Yes.
so I think a lot of us just choose to.
I think it can be exhausting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it can be days long conversations about it.
It's also always changing, right? So like 10 years from now, you're gonna say something that's okay now, and it, like,
And it
just
won't
something
be.
you're talking about the whole police issue, like.
Yeah.
It could have been still an issue, that's.
Yeah,
what
but
I'm
people
saying.
wouldn't have, people wouldn't have noticed necessarily.
Yeah, for sure.
Did you have a comment?
It is a comment. I have a fear of social media, so I
Yeah.
don't have Twitter. My Yahoo account still is an alias. It's not my real name.
Yeah.
But I work in mental health, so I realize I have to be more comfortable because I'm assisting and supporting younger men and women. And I know too that sometimes the eating disorders isn't on my radar. I'm looking to see do they have food in the house, but I'm not seeing are they eating?
Yeah.
Are they losing weight? Why are they losing weight? Why are they gaining weight? So yeah, I have to become more sensitive. Even though I've been working in the field for years, I still know this is an area I have to get a little bit more keen.
I think it is scary. Like I think it's important to acknowledge that it's like a bit of a scary space. Like you don't really know what you're gonna find. It's kind of hard to use if you're not like super fluent in like technology. And I think a good way to start engaging is just to kind of like lurk. That sounds weird, but like to just like get a Twitter account and not really use it. You could just follow people to start with.
That's what I did.
That's what my mom did for several years. And
I
like
don't follow too many because it can get overwhelming, but if you just, and then you can see how people interact. I still don't know how to do all this stuff, but it does help just to look at it and kind of watch it and see and follow a mental health hashtag or something that, you know, and see what the language is and see how many people interact. And it's kind of funny, and sometimes you put something out that you feel really strongly about it. One person gave you a heart. You know,
your day is made.
Nobody retweeted, but you know, you're like, okay, that one person sort of heard what I said. It's so exciting.
Yeah.
So that's from the beginner's angle of Twitter.
Yeah, because I think following is a really good way to start. Like I think that it just like kind of gets you familiar with it without really taking any huge risks. I don't think you even have to put like your name with it. If you want people to like not think that you're a troll, it's useful to put some sort of image as opposed to just the natural like egg that comes up. Because otherwise sometimes people will think that you're just out there to like say mean things to people. That's like a little known Twitter fact. I guess it's known in the Twitter world, but not in the kind of broader world. As if somebody just has an egg picture, people won't like retweet you or follow you. But I think like, yeah, just wading in lightly. Like I don't think that everybody needs to like dive into social media and be like full on like tweeting like many times a day as I like to. I think that it's perfectly okay to just see what goes on first, and really like, it's almost like thinking of it as like an anthropological experiment of like seeing what this world is about, right? And taking all of it with a grain of salt. Yeah. I don't know if that's at all helpful, but thank you for sharing the fear, because I think it's the fear is real. We get that a lot actually, even with I don't want to like out the social media committee at ASTA, but like we talk amongst ourselves before we share things, because sometimes people are afraid of, you know, the response that things might get. And so it's helpful to have people to bounce it off of before sharing, to make sure that, you know, maybe the tone is the tone that we're going for, or things like that. And we have had ongoing discussions about the fear, particularly in social justice spaces, of saying the wrong thing, or being told that your material is offensive in some way, which, you know, happens. But I can take the fall for it as the committee chair.
Even the coalition's conversation,
Yeah.
back and forth about which signs that we put up on International No Diet Week
Yeah.
are appropriate or not. You know, we don't use the word insanity anymore,
Yeah.
because that's
That's true. That was me calling out his name.
we're more sensitized. which is
Yeah,
strange.
well, it's true. I think it's just always helpful to have communities of people who you can talk to about these things too, because I think that helps to combat the fear. So if you have like a Twitter mentor or something. I was my mom's Twitter mentor. It's really nice to have my mom here. She's never seen me give a talk before, so I don't normally let her come.
Have they published a Twitter for Dummies book yet?
I mean, I have a couple guides that I have written. Yeah, like I during World Eating Disorder Day, which is June 2nd, I kind of took control of their Twitter when they were kind of like panicking, and so she was like, I need to like teach people how to use Twitter, but I don't have time to make something up, so I was like, you know what, I'll make a doc. So I made a document with like screenshots, and it's like basically a very basic like how to Twitter. I should tweet that out. I will tweet that out following this. And yeah, because it's just like, it's very basic. It shows like, I took screenshots, so it shows exactly where you press, and like there's arrows, and it was fun to make actually. I made one for Twitter and then TweetDeck, and because that's where I schedule my tweets. And
You mentioned a few organizations that are prominent on the Twitter.
yeah.
Are there others? Is there like a top 3 people who tweet in this field who?
Yeah, Academy for Eating Disorders is definitely up there. We have to post, well, we're supposed to post, oh gosh, this is being recorded. We're supposed to post 10 posts a day, each of us, because we each take a day, and we have a big committee, and it's like run like a well-oiled machine. So there are at least 10 tweets a day happening on that account, and all sorts of things like resources, like research articles, also popular media articles, also stuff about the organization. Another good one, oh gosh, in this field, like NIED's Twitter account is amazing. So that's at NIED Canada. I'm trying to think who else is big right now.
Andrea LaMarre.
Me? No, I definitely have like a medium-sized following. I'm trying to think, off the top of my head, it's hard to name. There's a woman named Lauren Mulheim. She does amazing work. Also,
Lauren Mulheim?
yes, Mulheim, Mulheim, I think. ASDA, the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. We don't tweet as much as we should, but I'm on it. Who else? Trans folks fighting eating disorders, definitely. So they're TFFED. And now going to positive pride. Yeah, I'd say those are some top ones. It's tough off the top of my head. Yeah.
What's the difference between NEDIC and NIED?
Great question. Oh, NEDIC is another one to follow. The NEDIC is the National Eating Disorder Information Center, and they are basically more, they're like a national organization to keep kind of like all of the info and stats on eating disorders, programs that are available. They have kind of more of a central database of like people who treat eating disorders and events that are happening around eating disorders, whereas NIED is a volunteer-run organization started by parents and with a team of psychologists and others who support them. And they're more, Carly, do you want to maybe say a bit more about NIED and like what your mission is?
Our kind of taglines are understanding, awareness, and action. So whereas NEDIC, we kind of differentiate their kind of information base. So if people have questions about where to find treatment or want a presentation about, general fact, we send them to NEDIC versus this is our 57th symposium that we run, so we try to run, we used to do them monthly, I'm trying to spread them out a bit and do them in various areas. We do a lot of advocacy work, so lobbying for change. We also kind of pride ourselves on being the catalyst of bringing organizations together, so bringing NEDIC, EDAC, we're in the process of helping to bring a national eating disorder strategy together, so we do lots of different things.
Pardon?
We do lots of different things.
Yes, you do.
NIED is amazing at like mobilizing, I would say. Like that's a real strength of NIED's, whereas NEDIC they have a very prescribed program of things that they do, which are amazing, and they have amazing resources. But they're, like I'd say NIED is very nimble in terms of responding to ongoing things that are happening in the world related to eating disorders in Canada. Whereas NEDIC is more, the information that exists that we often draw on, I think, like in the work with NIED, draws on NEDIC information. But they have, like school presentations, that sort of stuff.
But it would be more sort of individual, personal than NIED?
No, I'd say the other way around. I would say NIED is very like personal, like Wendy knows so many people. Like I wonder what Wendy's like email list is probably enormous. Like Wendy kind of like connects with people. She's the one of the founders, and she connects in with people a lot, and she knows like who does what and where, and she can connect people really well. And I think like NEDIC is more like this big national organization that it like houses information.
Kind of a database.
More of a database, yeah.
So we're volunteers, NIED, so we're not bound by like a big.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have a little bit more freedom to roll with the punches and change our mission as we see things growing and changing. So.
Yeah, and then there's another organization called the Eating Disorders Association of Canada, and they're the kind of research and treatment-based organization. So they have a conference every 2 years, and it's mainly focused on research. So like we go and we present about kind of research that's going on, and it's a bit of a fledgling organization. It's building, but it's primarily researchers at this point. So it's less like outreach to the public. Yeah, it's a bit tricky to differentiate between them, and I know we've had a lot of conversations about them. But
How old is NIED?
Just 5.
And NEDIC is
at least 30. Yeah.
Yeah, about 30. It's been around.
Really?
Yeah. So
NIED is really passionate about making change. So it was brought about by people that didn't have the best experiences in terms of getting help, whether it was personally or for their. Wendy is the founder, and her daughter has had a hard time getting the help that she needs. So that's really it's based on that reason. So.
yeah, it's been amazing connecting with me. So.
Well, there certainly is a need.
There's a need for NIED. There really is.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.
So we do have some of our symposiums are on our YouTube channel, which I think is on our website. So some of our other topics of the symposiums that we've had in the past. We team up with NEDIC and they live stream our events sometimes. So if you check that out, we've got some other topics.
I get NEDIC's
Yeah.
thing, so I should read through it.
Absolutely, yeah.